Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we're exploring one of mythology's most tragic, misunderstood, and endlessly fascinating figures. We're descending into the story of Medusa, and I promise you, what you've heard before is only half the truth. Get comfortable, settle in, and let's begin. When you think of Medusa, what comes to mind? Perhaps you see her in your mind's eye, a grotesque creature, serpents writhing where hair once grew, her gaze so terrible it turns flesh to stone. Perhaps you see Perseus, the hero, sneaking through shadows with a bronze shield held before him like a mirror, seeking to claim the impossible prize of her head. Perhaps you imagine her as little more than an obstacle, a monster to be slain, a test for a hero to overcome. But tonight, we're going to peel back those layers. We're going to ask the questions that the old stories rarely address. Who was Medusa before she became the Gorgon? What made her different from her sisters? And most importantly, was she truly a monster? Or was she something far more complex, more human, more tragic than we've ever been told? The ancient Greeks understood something fundamental about their myths. They understood that stories shift depending on who tells them. A hero's triumph can look very different from the perspective of the one defeated. A monster can be reframed as a victim. A punishment can reveal itself as cruelty, masquerading as justice. And perhaps nowhere is this truer than in the tale of Medusa, a woman transformed, hunted, and killed, whose story has been told and retold by everyone except, crucially, herself. We know her from Ovid, the Roman poet who wrote in the 1st century of the Common Era. We know her from Hesiod, the ancient Greek poet whose Theogony gives us the earliest written account of the Gorgons. We know her from countless retellings, artworks, and modern interpretations. But what we rarely do is sit with the contradictions. What we rarely do is ask why the versions change so drastically depending on who's telling the tale. Why does Ovid give us a transformation story, while Hesiod seems to present her as simply monstrous from birth? Why does one account make her a priestess with a sacred vow, while another makes no mention of such details? These are not idle questions. They matter deeply when we're trying to understand who Medusa really was. The versions we have are filtered through male perspectives, filtered through the viewpoints of heroes and gods, filtered through the biases of the societies that preserved these stories. And yet, within those filtered accounts, we can still find traces of something else. We can find glimpses of a woman who was far more than the monster she became. We can find evidence of a tragedy so profound that it echoes across more than 2,000 years. Let's start at the beginning, with the old myths, with the genealogies and the family trees that Greek mythology loved to lay out with such precision. These aren't just dry lists of names. They're a way of understanding how power flows, how chaos breeds monsters, and how even divinity can be cruel. Long before there was a Medusa, there were the Gorgons. And before there were Gorgons, there was the primordial sea itself, personified as a god. Phorcys, the old sea god, ancient even by the standards of Greek mythology, looked upon the ancient seas and desired companionship. He took as his mate Ceto, whose name itself means sea monster, the personification of all the dreadful things lurking in the deep. They were not lovers in any tender sense. They were cosmic forces, older than Olympus, older than Zeus himself. They were elemental, terrifying, and they bred creatures that reflected their terrible nature. From the union of Phorcys and Ceto came a dizzying array of monstrous offspring. There were the Graeae, the Grey Women, ancient and wise, but twisted by age. There was Ladon, the great dragon who would guard the golden apples of the Hesperides, a serpent so fearsome that even the heroes of legend would fear him. There was Scylla, that terrible creature of the sea, and Thosa, who would mother Polyphemus, the Cyclops who would one day trap Odysseus and his men in a cave, devouring them one by one. And among these children, born from the foam of the sea and the dark dreams of ancient gods, were three sisters who would become known throughout history as the Gorgons. According to Hesiod, whose Theogony remains our oldest written source for these creatures, there were three Gorgons, Stheno, Euryale, and Medusa. Hesiod tells us about them in a brief passage, deceptively simple in its language, but containing depths of meaning if we care to look deeper. He describes them as dwellers in the far reaches of the world, near the borders of night itself, in a place where the normal rules of existence seem not to apply. Two of them, Stheno and Euryale, were immortal. They lived forever, unchanging, eternal in their monstrous form. But Medusa, the third sister, was different. She was born mortal. Think about that for a moment. In a family of monsters, born to cosmic forces of terror and destruction, there emerged a mortal child. She was the weak one, in a sense, the vulnerable one. She would age, she would die. In a family of the deathless, she was the only one who could truly be destroyed. The ancient Greeks saw this as significant, and rightfully so. Mortality was not a blessing in Greek mythology. It was a vulnerability, a weakness, a mark of being lesser than the gods. And yet, we'll discover that Medusa's mortality may have been the most important thing about her. The earliest depictions of Medusa in Greek art tell us that the ancients were already transforming her into something different from her sisters, even before Ovid put pen to parchment. On ancient pottery, on vases that date back to the 7th and 6th centuries before the Common Era, we see her depicted, but not always in the form we might expect. Some early representations show her as a creature of tremendous power, yes, but also with distinctly feminine features. Her face remains visible in ways that suggest not just horror, but also beauty, twisted by curse. The artistic record shows us an evolution, a shift from depicting her as purely monstrous to depicting her with increasingly human features, particularly around the face and body. Consider the famous Temple of Artemis in Corfu, which dates to the early 6th century before the Common Era. On its pediment, we see Medusa depicted alongside her son Pegasus, and the image is remarkable. Rather than a simple monster, she is portrayed as a complex figure, in the midst of childbirth, even as she is being slain. Here, already, the ancient Greeks were complicating the simple story. They were asking, what was she really? Was she only a monster? Or was she something more? The very act of depicting her pregnant, in the moment of giving birth, was a way of reclaiming her humanity, of acknowledging that despite everything, she was a mother, a woman, a being capable of creation even at the moment of her destruction. The Gorgons lived, according to most accounts, far from the civilized world. Some sources place them in Libya, in the distant southern lands that were to the ancient Greeks what the edge of the world might be to us. Herodotus, the ancient historian, reported that the Berber people of Libya spoke of a goddess who had serpents for hair, and it's possible, even likely, that the Greek myth of Medusa was influenced by, or even derived from, African religious traditions. The 2nd century novelist Dionysios Skytobrachion places Medusa definitively in Libya, and there are archaeological hints that suggest the Gorgon imagery had deep roots in Libyan and other non-Greek religious traditions, particularly in the veneration of serpentine deities. But whether they were in Libya, or on an island at the edge of the known world, or in some liminal space between the world of men and the realm of the gods, the point remained the same. The Gorgons dwelled in isolation. They were not part of the civilized world. They were not to be encountered on normal roads or in normal places. To come upon a Gorgon was to have wandered far indeed from safety, to have ventured into the wild margins where normal rules no longer applied. What were these creatures like in their early forms? The descriptions vary, but across the sources, certain elements recur with consistency. They were female, and this gender was significant. There was no male equivalent in the Greek pantheon, and we should not underestimate what this tells us about how ancient Greeks processed danger, power, and the feminine. These were creatures of tremendous power and strength, but they were women. They had weapons that transcended the physical. Their very gaze could destroy. In some early depictions, they were winged, able to fly. Their power not limited to a single place, but spread across the world. And their hair, so consistently described, so consistently emphasized, was the hair of serpents. Snakes writhed where hair should grow, snakes with venom in their fangs, snakes that moved with will and intention, independent of the body they crowned. The snakes are crucial to understanding what Medusa represented. In Greek religion and philosophy, snakes were not simple symbols of evil. They were sacred to many gods. They represented wisdom, regeneration, healing. They shed their skins and were reborn, making them symbols of transformation and renewal. And yet, they were also dangerous, venomous, deadly. They were liminal creatures themselves, living between water and land, between the civilized world and the wild. To have snakes for hair was to be marked as dangerous, powerful, and fundamentally different. It was to be marked as a threat to the normal order of things. Now Medusa's immortal sisters, Stheno and Euryale, are largely silent figures in the myths we possess. We know them mainly as followers of Medusa's story, not as central figures in their own right. When Perseus slays Medusa, they pursue him, but he escapes using magical gifts. In most accounts, they don't speak, don't act beyond simple pursuit and rage. This is significant. It's as though, once they appear alongside Medusa, they fade into the background, their individuality subsumed into the collective image of the Gorgons. In some accounts, both sisters are portrayed as inherently monstrous from birth, without the complications that attend Medusa's story. They are simply creatures, simply monsters, creatures of chaos and danger, with no further depth to explore. But this treatment itself is revealing. It suggests that the more complex, more tragic version of the story, Medusa's story, was always the one that mattered. It was always the one with the most resonance, the most weight, the most to tell us about fate, injustice, and the complicated nature of power and victimhood. Even in the ancient world, storytellers seemed to sense that there was something deeper to Medusa's tale than simple monstrosity. Before Ovid, before the Romans, before the transformation stories that would make Medusa's narrative so poignant. The ancient Greeks knew something that modern retellings sometimes forget. They knew that Medusa was beautiful. The sources are consistent on this point, almost insistent about it. Medusa possessed beauty that was remarkable, that was noted, that was significant enough to include in the oldest accounts we have. Ovid, writing centuries after Hesiod, would expand on this beauty to an extraordinary degree. In his Metamorphoses, he describes Medusa in her original form in terms that are almost rapturous. He tells us that her golden hair was the wonder of all who beheld it, that her beauty was such that suitors flocked to her, that her appearance was capable of stirring desire in anyone who saw her. She once had charms, and to gain her love, a rival crowd of envious lovers strove, he writes, and then follows with the observation that among all her beauties, nothing exceeded the wonder of her hair. Her hair was her chief glory, Ovid tells us, emphasizing again and again the remarkable nature of those golden locks, the way they caught the light, the way they marked her as someone special, someone worthy of attention. This is no accident. The emphasis on her hair is not incidental. Her hair was not simply a feature of her beauty. It was the focus of that beauty, the thing most remarked upon, the thing most precious about her appearance. Golden ringlets, they're described as in some accounts, catching the light, flowing with the kind of movement and life that would later be so hideously inverted when those same ringlets became serpents. The beauty that once inspired admiration would become the source of horror and fear. The thing that drew people to her would become the thing that turned them to stone. But before we get to the transformation, we need to understand Medusa before the curse. We need to understand her in the form that the myths promise existed, the form that was not monstrous, not terrifying, not dangerous in the way that her later form would be. In Ovid's account, and in the accounts influenced by Ovid, Medusa was a priestess. This detail is crucial, though it's important to note that different ancient sources emphasize it differently. Ovid himself doesn't dwell extensively on this priesthood, nor does he mention any specific vow of chastity, though later interpreters would add this detail. He simply tells us that Medusa was known for her beauty, that Poseidon desired her, and that when he couldn't resist the temptation, he took her. The priesthood detail raises questions that are fundamental to understanding her story. If she was a priestess of Athena, the virgin goddess, then being a priestess would have meant dedicating her life to a sacred purpose. It would have meant removing herself from the normal cycles of life that other women experienced. It would have meant a kind of sacrifice, a kind of surrender of ordinary human experience in service to something larger, something divine. Some accounts suggest that this priesthood included a vow of chastity, that Medusa had sworn herself to remain untouched, pure, set apart. This adds another layer of tragedy to what was to come. Not only was she assaulted, not only was her body violated, but the violation occurred within the very temple where she had made her sacred pledge, in the space where she was supposed to be most protected and most honored. The violation was a desecration not just of her person, but of her commitment, her dedication, her sacred purpose. But here we need to be careful. Not all ancient sources agree on these details. Hesiod, our earliest source, says nothing about Medusa being a priestess, nothing about any vow of chastity. In the Theogony, Hesiod simply mentions that Poseidon had relations with Medusa, and that from this union came Pegasus and Chrysaor. The tone is matter-of-fact, without the moral complexity that Ovid would later add. Hesiod doesn't describe it as a violation or an assault. He He simply states it as a fact. This difference between the sources is important. It tells us that the story evolved, that later storytellers added details and moral frameworks that earlier versions didn't include. It tells us that the mythological tradition was not monolithic, not fixed, but rather something that was shaped and reshaped by each generation of storytellers, each bringing their own concerns and their own moral frameworks to bear. What we can say with confidence across all the versions is that Medusa was exceptional. She was different from her siblings, different from her immortal sisters. She had achieved some kind of status, some kind of position, some kind of recognition that set her apart. Whether this was as a priestess or simply as a woman of remarkable beauty whose fame had spread, she was not invisible. She was not anonymous. She was someone. And this, in the cruel logic of the myths, would be her vulnerability. To be seen, to be remarked upon, to be noted as beautiful or special or set apart, was to become a target. It was to attract the attention of powers far greater than oneself. It was to invite disaster. Medusa lived in a world where gods acted without constraint, where their desires were not questioned or resisted, where power flowed downward from the divine to the mortal with no recourse, no appeal, no protection. She lived in a world where being beautiful was dangerous, where standing out was a liability, where being desired could be the worst thing that could happen to you. And she was desired by Poseidon, the god of the seas, the god of earthquakes, one of the mightiest of the Olympian gods. He wanted her, and in the mythology of ancient Greece, when a god wanted something, there was rarely an option to refuse. The story of Medusa and Poseidon is, at its core, a story about power and its abuse. It is a story about what happens when someone powerful desires someone powerless. It is a story that repeats itself throughout the corpus of Greek mythology, with variations, but with a consistent underlying truth. Gods take what they want from mortals. The relationship between Poseidon and Athena is relevant here. These two gods shared a rivalry that was ancient and deep. They had competed for the patronage of the city of Athens itself. According to the myths, Poseidon offered the gift of a salt spring to the Athenians, while Athena offered an olive tree. The Athenians chose Athena's gift, and Poseidon never quite forgave them, or her. There was a tension between them, an antagonism that would have been clear to anyone familiar with the myths. So when Poseidon, the god of the seas, set his eyes on Medusa, was he drawn to her simply for her beauty? Or was there something else at work? Was there perhaps an element of spite, of wanting to defy Athena, of taking something that belonged in Athena's domain? The texts don't explicitly tell us, but the setting of the violation in a temple to Athena suggests something deliberate. Medusa was in or near a temple to Athena when Poseidon encountered her. In Ovid's account, he ravages her within the temple itself, in the sacred space where Athena was worshipped. This is not merely a personal violation, though it is that. It is also a violation of sacred space, an act of profound disrespect, a desecration of the goddess's own sanctuary. In some accounts, Medusa runs to the temple seeking protection, and it is there that Poseidon catches her, violating her within the very walls that should have offered sanctuary. In other accounts, the encounter is less framed as pursuit or escape, and more as an inevitable exercise of divine power over mortal flesh. Either way, the outcome is the same. Medusa is assaulted by a god, in or near a sacred space. and she becomes pregnant with his children. The question of consent is central here, though it's a question that the ancient sources sometimes obscure. Modern sensibilities would call this rape without hesitation. Ovid uses language that could be interpreted as seduction or as assault, depending on the reader's perspective. Some ancient commentators seem to view it as something Medusa might have welcomed, or at least as something that was simply inevitable when a god desired a mortal woman. By the standards of the ancient world, powerful men taking what they wanted from less powerful women was not aberrant behavior. It was not punishable. It was, in some sense, the nature of how power operated. And yet, even the ancient sources suggest that something was wrong here. The fact that Athena was so enraged when she discovered what had happened suggests that even in the ancient world, there was something understood as a violation, something understood as wrong, something understood as worthy of punishment. Medusa found herself pregnant. She was carrying the children of a god, which should have been an honor, which should have been a source of power and prestige. In the mythology of ancient Greece, demigods held special status. They had access to divine power through their parentage. But Medusa's pregnancy would not be allowed to come to term naturally. She would not be allowed to give birth to these children under normal circumstances. In Ovid's account, Athena cursed Medusa precisely because she was pregnant, because the act of creating life with Poseidon in Athena's temple was, in the goddess's view, an insult that demanded punishment. Some accounts suggest that Athena rendered Medusa unable to bear the children naturally, and it was only when Perseus beheaded her that the children could emerge from her body, as though her death was necessary for their birth. This detail is almost too horrible to dwell on, and yet it's crucial to understanding Medusa's tragedy. Her children could only be born from her death. She could only give birth by being killed. In the deepest sense, her motherhood and her death became inseparable, intertwined in a way that seems designed by fate itself to maximize suffering. The question of what Medusa experienced, what she felt, what she wanted, is absent from the classical sources. We are not given her perspective. We are not told how she felt about Poseidon's advances, how she felt about her assault, how she felt about her pregnancy, how she felt about her curse. The ancient texts focus on the gods, on Poseidon's desire, on Athena's rage, and Medusa's inner life is left largely unexamined. This absence is itself meaningful. It suggests that Medusa, in her original form, was treated in the mythological tradition as a secondary character, a background figure, someone whose significance lay primarily in how she affected more important beings. She was something that happened to her rather than someone who happened to things. It would take centuries. It would take the modern era, with its emphasis on individual psychology and interior experience, for someone to seriously ask, what did Medusa want? What did she feel? What was her experience of all this? When Athena discovered what had happened in her temple, she was enraged. The sources are consistent on this point, though they vary in what they describe as the source of her rage. Was she angry at Poseidon for violating her sacred space? Was she angry at Medusa for being the object of Poseidon's desire? Was she angry because her temple had been desecrated? Was she angry because a priestess under her protection had broken a sacred vow? The answer, it seems, is that Athena's rage was directed primarily at Medusa, not at Poseidon. Despite his being a god of equal power, despite his being the one who acted, despite the fact that it was his assault that had occurred, Athena chose to punish the victim rather than the perpetrator. This is one of the most disturbing elements of the Medusa story, and it's one that modern interpreters have seized upon as evidence of the profound injustice built into the mythological structure itself. Medusa had no power over Poseidon. She could not have stopped him. She was a mortal woman in a world where gods did as they pleased. And yet, it was she who paid the price for his transgression. Athena's punishment was catastrophic. She transformed Medusa from a beautiful woman into a gorgon. But what exactly did this transformation entail? The descriptions are vivid and horrible. Medusa's golden hair, the hair that had been her glory, that had been the subject of admiration and desire, was transformed into a writhing mass of serpents. Each serpent was alive, with its own will, with its own hunger. They would hiss and strike and move independent of Medusa's conscious control. They were, in some sense, a part of her, but also something alien, something that she could not master. But the transformation went beyond the physical. Medusa was given a power, a terrifying power. Her gaze alone could turn any living thing to stone. To look upon her face was to be fixed in place, transformed from flesh to mineral, petrified in the most literal sense. It was a power that made her lethal, that made her dangerous, that made her something that no one could approach without risking death. In some interpretations, this power is presented as a defense, as a gift, as a way of protecting Medusa from a world that had proven so cruel. Once she had this power, no man could touch her. No man could desire her without risking his own annihilation. In this reading, Athena's curse becomes a twisted kind of protection, a way of ensuring that Medusa could never be violated again. But this interpretation, while tempting, feels like a rationalization of the irrational. It's a way of making the curse seem less like cruelty and more like wisdom or care. And it fundamentally misses the point of what happened to Medusa. She didn't ask for this power. She didn't want to be dangerous. She wanted to exist, to live, perhaps to give birth to her children. Instead, she was transformed into something so terrible that human beings fled at the sight of her. Moreover, the curse made it impossible for Medusa to live in human society. She had to retreat to the margins, to the wild places, to the spaces where no one ventured. She was exiled not just by others' fear, but by the very nature of her transformation. She could not walk among humans. She could not interact with society. She was cut off, separated, alone. Other interpretations suggest that Athena's curse was not really a curse at all, but simply Athena's response to a violation of her temple. Athena, as a goddess of wisdom and warfare, was the protector of her sacred spaces. And when those spaces were violated, she responded with force. She transformed Medusa not as a punishment designed specifically for her suffering, but as a means of preventing further violation. The transformation made Medusa into a guardian, a protector of her own space, something too terrible to be approached. But this reading also seems to miss something important. Because yes, Athena's action did create a guardian, but that guardian was also a prisoner. Medusa was trapped in her own form, trapped in her power, unable to be touched without killing, unable to have intimate contact with anyone, unable to fulfill the basic human desires for connection and relationship and family. The deepest tragedy may be this. Medusa's curse gave her power, yes, but power that was completely useless, that was actually worse than useless. What good is the power to turn others to stone when what you need is to be able to touch someone without killing them? What good is being too dangerous to approach when what you crave is connection? The curse gave her a weapon, but took away everything that mattered. And yet, we should not ignore the complexity here. Athena, as a goddess, had reasons for what she did. She was not acting out of simple spite, even if it might appear that way to modern sensibilities. The violation of her temple was a serious matter. The desecration of a sacred space called for response. And Medusa, though a victim of Poseidon, was also, from a certain perspective, complicit in the violation of the goddess's sanctuary. These are hard truths to sit with. They don't excuse the punishment, but they do help us understand how the ancient Greeks thought about responsibility and consequence. Some later sources suggest that Stheno and Euryale, Medusa's immortal sisters, were also transformed or were similarly monstrous as a result of their association with Medusa or as a result of supporting her during her tribulation. This raises another layer of complexity. If the sisters were transformed too, then Medusa's tragedy wasn't simply her own. It rippled outward, affecting those closest to her. Though immortal, they were cursed to share the form of the Gorgon, to be feared and hunted alongside their sister. Though powerful, they were trapped in exile and isolation, just as Medusa was. After her transformation, Medusa could not remain in the civilized world. She had to flee, to retreat to the margins, to find a place where her mere presence would not turn people to stone, where her appearance would not cause panic and death. Different accounts place her in different locations. Some sources speak of a cave, a place of isolation and darkness where Medusa made her home. Other sources, particularly those influenced by the geographer Herodotus and the later novelist Dionysios Skytobrachion, place her in Libya, in the distant, exotic lands that were, to the ancient Greeks, beyond the edge of civilization. The specific location matters less than the fundamental fact of her exile. Wherever she was separated from the normal world. She was living in a liminal space, neither fully part of the mortal world nor part of the divine realm. The mythology describes her dwelling with her sisters, Stheno and Euryale. These three monstrous women lived together, and we can only imagine what that existence was like. They could be together without the constant risk of death, but they were utterly cut off from everyone else. They were not hostile by nature, but their very existence was hostile to the normal human world. They could not leave their isolation without causing death and terror. They were prisoners in their own forms, guardians of a space that was defined precisely by the absence of humanity. In some accounts, people did find their way to the Gorgon's lair. Men ventured forth seeking glory or seeking wealth, driven by the desire to claim the head of a Gorgon as a trophy. According to the myths, these men looked upon Medusa and were turned to stone. And over time, the lair of the Gorgons became filled with statues, beautiful, terrifying statues of men frozen in their final moment of horror. Medusa, through no choice of her own, became a collector of the dead. Her very presence killed, and the remains of the dead surrounded her, a monument to her curse and to human hubris. During this exile, Medusa was carrying the children of Poseidon. She was pregnant, growing heavier with the weight of offspring that she could not give birth to. She was, in effect, a prison for her own children, holding them inside her until some force external to herself could release them. The texts don't describe what this felt like for her. Don't try to imagine her experience of pregnancy in the form of a monster, separated from society, living in darkness and isolation. But one can only imagine that it was a special kind of torture. What was Medusa's psychological state during this time? The ancient sources don't tell us, but we can infer. She had been transformed from a beautiful woman into a creature that inspired terror. She had lost her former life completely. She had been separated from human society, from the possibility of relationships, from the basic experiences that define human existence. She had been punished for something she didn't do, punished by the very goddess she had served, punished by one who should have protected her. One might expect rage, one might expect bitterness, resentment, a consuming need for revenge against those who had wronged her. And indeed, in some of the sources, particularly in later artistic depictions, Medusa is shown with an expression of tremendous anger, of furious power, of a being consumed by rage at her fate. But there's another possibility, another way of reading her isolation. Perhaps she was also broken. Perhaps she was also grief-stricken, mourning the loss of her human form, her former life, her identity. Perhaps she was also confused, struggling to understand what had happened to her, why it had happened, how she could have done something to deserve it. Perhaps, along with any rage, there was also profound sadness. The artistic record from ancient Greece shows us Medusa depicted in various ways during this period. In the Archaic period, the 7th and 6th centuries before the Common Era, she is shown as fully monstrous, as horrifying, her face twisted in an expression of terrible power. She is shown as winged in many representations, capable of flight. She is shown with serpents writhing about her head, with the snakes rendered in great detail, showing them as active, aggressive, dangerous. But as the Greek artistic tradition evolved, so too did the depiction of Medusa. By the classical period, particularly by the late 5th and 4th centuries before the Common Era, Medusa began to be depicted with increasing beauty. Her face became less grotesque, more refined. Her body became more clearly human. In some representations, she is almost indistinguishable from other female figures, except for the snakes that crown her head. The snakes remain, but everything else about her becomes increasingly beautiful, increasingly human. This evolution in artistic representation may reflect a changing understanding of Medusa in Greek culture. Perhaps, as Greek thought matured, as tragic drama became more sophisticated, as the culture developed a more complex understanding of human suffering and moral responsibility, Medusa began to be seen differently. Perhaps she began to be understood not as simply monstrous, but as tragic. Perhaps her image began to carry not just terror, but also pity. The image of her in the state of exile would have been a subject for Greek artists and storytellers to meditate upon. Here was a being of tremendous power, the power to turn anyone to stone with a glance, and yet completely powerless, completely isolated, completely unable to use her power for anything except self-defense. Her strength was her prison. Her power was her curse. Everything changed when Perseus found her. But before we arrive at that moment, we need to understand what was waiting inside Medusa. We need to understand the children she carried, Pegasus and Chrysaor, the two offspring of Medusa and Poseidon. Their birth is one of the strangest births in all of mythology, a birth that could only happen in the world of the myths, where the rules are different from the world we inhabit. According to Hesiod, Pegasus was a winged horse, not born from Medusa's womb like a normal foal, but rather emerging from her severed neck after Perseus decapitated her. At the moment of her death, at the moment when her blood spilled, the horse sprang forth, fully formed, with magnificent wings, ready to fly. Pegasus was not a normal child. He was a miraculous being, born not from the normal process of birth, but from his mother's violent death. Chrysaor was her other child, and he is less well known than Pegasus, perhaps less celebrated, but no less remarkable. He is described variously in different sources as a giant, as a being who wielded a golden sword, as a figure of tremendous strength and power. Like Pegasus, he sprang from Medusa's severed neck after her death. He too was born at the moment of his mother's death. In some accounts, the children were within Medusa during her lifetime as a cursed being, growing inside her, waiting for a release that only death could provide. The curse that prevented her from giving birth naturally meant that these children were trapped inside her, and only through her violent death could they come into being. This adds another layer of complexity to the tragedy. Medusa's children depended on her death for their birth. In order for them to exist, she had to be killed. Pegasus would go on to have a remarkable existence. He would become one of the most famous creatures in all of mythology. He would be tamed by the hero Bellerophon, who would ride him in his great exploits against the monsters of the earth. Pegasus would eventually be honored by Zeus himself, becoming the bearer of the god's lightning bolts, trusted with the most sacred and important duties. Pegasus would achieve a kind of deification, becoming immortal, becoming honored, becoming famous throughout the world. But at what cost? Pegasus was born from his mother's death. He never knew Medusa, except in the form she took in Medusa's womb, a form she could never express in life. He was a being created through violence, born through his mother's decapitation, brought into the world through her destruction. And yet his life was glorious. His life was celebrated. His life was everything that his mother's life never could be. Chrysaor too went on to have children of his own. He married Caliro, an Oceanid, and fathered Geryon, the triple-bodied giant who would later be slain by Heracles in one of that hero's famous labors. Chrysaor thus became a progenitor, a beginning point for further generations. His descendants would populate the world with creatures and beings that would themselves enter into mythology and story. The existence of Pegasus and Chrysaor complicates the tragedy of Medusa in a particular way. On one hand, it seems that despite everything, Medusa did birth offspring that went on to remarkable existences. In some sense, she did achieve a kind of immortality through them. She was not childless. She was not barren. She was not the end of a line. Through Pegasus and Chrysaor, something of her lived on. But on the other hand, her children's existence is bound up entirely with her death. They could not exist while she lived. They could not be born in the normal way. They could not have a mother who raised them, who cared for them, who was present in their lives. Their birth was their mother's death. Their existence required her annihilation. One modern interpretation suggests that Pegasus and Chrysaor represent the duality of Medusa's nature. Pegasus, the beautiful winged horse, represents the beauty and grace of what Medusa once was or could have been. Chrysaor, the warrior with the golden sword, represents the power and strength that Medusa possessed in her cursed form. In this reading, her two children together represent the two aspects of Medusa's being that were forced to remain separate, that were trapped inside her, and could only be released through her death. It's a poetic interpretation, and like many modern interpretations of Medusa, it attempts to find meaning and synthesis, where the original texts offer only tragedy and fragmentation. It tries to suggest that there was something redemptive about what happened to Medusa, that she didn't simply suffer and die, but that her suffering gave rise to something beautiful and powerful. But we should be careful not to use such interpretations to minimize or gloss over the basic horror of her story. Now we come to the hero. Now we come to the part of the story that most people know, the part that has been celebrated and honored throughout the ages. The story of Perseus and his quest to slay the Gorgon. Perseus was the son of Zeus, the king of the gods, and Danae, a mortal woman. Like many demigods in Greek mythology, Perseus had access to divine power through his parentage, but he was not a god himself. He was subject to death, to injury, to the limitations of mortality. He was a hero, which in Greek understanding meant someone of exceptional ability and courage, someone whose deeds were worthy of story and memory, but still fundamentally a mortal man. There were reasons for Perseus's quest, reasons that had nothing directly to do with Medusa. According to most versions of the myth, there was a king named Polydectes who desired Danae, Perseus's mother. Polydectes wanted to marry her, or wanted her for himself in some sense, but he was blocked from approaching her because her son stood in the way. So Polydectes devised a task. He asked Perseus to bring him the head of Medusa as a wedding gift, or as a way to settle a debt, or simply as a test. And Perseus, whether because he was proud, or because he felt obliged, or because he was manipulated into agreeing, accepted this task. Perseus did not set out on this quest with any awareness of Medusa's tragedy. He was not seeking to liberate her or to end her suffering. He was seeking to accomplish a task, to prove himself, to gain a prize. The quest itself was couched in terms of heroic achievement. To slay a monster, to bring back a trophy, to accomplish the seemingly impossible. This was the stuff of heroic legend. But before he could confront Medusa, Perseus needed help. And here the mythology reveals something important about how power operated in the ancient world. A hero could not accomplish great deeds alone. They needed the assistance of the gods. They needed divine gifts, divine weapons, divine knowledge. So Perseus received help from Athena and Hermes. From Athena, he received a bronze shield, polished so brightly that it could serve as a mirror. From Hermes, he received winged sandals that would allow him to fly, and a sickle or adamantine sword with which to strike. He also received a magical pouch in which to place Medusa's head after he decapitated her. In some versions of the myth, Perseus also receives the cap of Hades, a magical cap that renders the wearer invisible. This addition is significant because it means that Perseus could approach Medusa without being seen, could sneak up on her, could ensure that she never had a chance to look upon him directly. From the Graiai, the gray women who were sisters to the Gorgons, Perseus extracted information about where to find Medusa. According to one version of the story, he sees their shared eye and tooth, for these ancient women were so old that they shared a single eye and a single tooth among them, and refused to return these items until they told him what he needed to know. It's a bit of trickery, a bit of coercion, but it was effective. They told him where to find their sister. The journey itself is not extensively described in most sources, but it would have been a long one. Perseus would have traveled far from the civilized world, to the edges of the known maps, to the places where gods and monsters dwelled. He would have traveled with the aid of his magical sandals, soaring through the sky, moving faster than any mortal could. He would have arrived at last at the place where Medusa dwelt. It's important to note that at this point, according to most versions of the story, Perseus had never seen Medusa. He had heard of her, had been told what to expect, but he had no personal knowledge of her, no understanding of her as a person. To him, she was simply a monster. She was simply a task. She was simply something that needed to be done. And when he arrived at her dwelling place, he found Medusa asleep. She was sleeping, unaware of the danger approaching, unaware that her death was coming. In some sense, her vulnerability at this moment, asleep, unguarded, unaware, is the only thing that made her death possible. Had she been awake, had she seen Perseus, she would have turned him to stone immediately. He would have become another statue in her collection of the dead. But she was asleep, and Perseus, guided by the polished shield of Athena, moved in close enough to use his sword or sickle to sever her head from her body. This moment, the moment of Medusa's death, is the climax of her story as it has been told for millennia. It is the moment that has been celebrated, the moment that has been commemorated in art and story, the moment that defines the Perseus myth. But from what perspective are we celebrating it? If we look at this moment from Perseus's perspective, it is a triumph. He has accomplished an impossible task. He has slain a monster. He has proven his courage and his capability. He has secured a magical and powerful artifact, the head of Medusa, which he can now use to accomplish further feats. By the standards of heroic mythology, this is a victory. This is success. This is the moment the hero achieves his goal. But if we look at this moment from Medusa's perspective, what do we see? We see a woman who has been transformed into a monster against her will, who has been punished for a crime she did not commit, who has lived in isolation and exile for however long the curse has held her. Some accounts suggest it was only recently that she was cursed, while others imply it was a long time. And now, while she sleeps, completely defenseless, a hero sent by the gods themselves approaches and kills her. It is not, by any normal understanding, a fair fight. It is not a battle. It is not a confrontation where both sides have an equal chance of survival. It is, more accurately, an execution. It is a murder of someone who is defenseless and unaware. The ancient sources don't typically frame it this way. They frame it as heroic. They celebrate it. The poets sing of Perseus's skill and courage. The artists depict him in the moment of her slaying, often with Athena herself present to witness and validate the deed. But this is exactly the kind of narrative slippage that we should be alert to. This is exactly the kind of moment where the perspective of the victors has been written into the story so thoroughly that it seems like objective truth. We have been trained to see this as heroic because that's how the heroes told the story. And yet, if we look at the sources, we find hints that even the ancient world was aware of the moral complexity of what was happening. The very fact that Medusa is sleeping, that Perseus must use a mirror to avoid her gaze, that he cannot face her directly, all of this suggests a kind of understanding that what is about to happen is not a fair contest. In modern retellings, particularly in feminist interpretations of the myth, Medusa's death has sometimes been reframed as murder, as the unjust killing of a victim, as a continuation of the injustice that began with Poseidon's assault and continued with Athena's curse. This reframing is significant. It challenges the heroic narrative. It asks us to see the story from a different angle. Now, Medusa does have power. She has the power to turn people to stone with a glance. She is not completely helpless. She is terrifying and dangerous. But she is also completely isolated, living in exile, unable to threaten anyone except those who come to her. And Perseus comes to her as a representative of society, as a hero sent by a king, as someone bearing gifts from the gods themselves. The imbalance of power is crushing. Medusa has power, yes, but she is trapped and isolated. Perseus has divine assistance and magical weapons. The outcome was never in doubt. The only surprise would have been if somehow Medusa survived. When Perseus severed her head, her blood spilled, and from that blood emerged Pegasus and Chrysaor, the two children that could only be born through her death. In this moment, we see the final terrible irony of Medusa's existence. Her children, whom she carried, whom she could not give birth to naturally, whom she was essentially a prison for, came into being only through her violent death. Pegasus, the beautiful winged horse, emerged from her blood, and immediately the horse flew away. Pegasus would go on to have his magnificent adventures, to be the bearer of Zeus's lightning, to be honored and celebrated. He would have a remarkable and glorious existence. All of this was possible only because his mother was dead. Chrysaor too emerged, the golden-sworded giant, and he too would go on to have a life of consequence and meaning. Like his brother, he would never know his mother in any meaningful sense. His existence was predicated on her annihilation. In one sense, Medusa's story ends with her death. Her breathing stopped, her consciousness ceased. Whatever she was, whatever she might have been, it was extinguished. By all the normal ways we measure a life, Medusa's life was over. But in another sense, Medusa's story continues beyond her death. In fact, one could argue that her power only truly came into full expression after she was dead. Perseus took the head of Medusa and placed it in his magical pouch, the one that had been given to him by Hermes. The head retained all of its power, even after death. It could still turn people to stone with a glance. It was still a weapon of terrible potency. As Perseus traveled, he used this power. In one famous account, he flew past the giant Atlas, who held the sky aloft. Atlas tried to attack Perseus, and Perseus turned him to stone by showing him the head of Medusa. The Titan, who had held the heavens for ages, became a stone mountain, frozen in place for eternity. Later, Perseus used the head to save the princess Andromeda from a sea monster. He turned the monster to stone, stopping its rampage, saving the princess's life. For this act, he was celebrated as a hero. He was honored. He was lauded as a savior. And eventually, Perseus gave the head to Athena. The goddess attached it to her shield, her aegis, and from that point on, the head of Medusa became part of the goddess's own power. It became a symbol of Athena's invulnerability, her connection to divine wisdom and protection. The image of the head, the snake's writhing, the terrifying face, became known as the Gorgonean, and it would be placed on shields and breastplates throughout the ancient world and for centuries beyond. In this way, Medusa became a symbol. She became a tool of divine power. She became something used by the gods to protect themselves and their favored heroes. She became a weapon, a talisman, a thing to be deployed in service to purposes that had nothing to do with her own. But there's something even more extraordinary in the sources. Medusa's blood itself had power. According to the mythological tradition, when her head was severed, the blood that spilled had remarkable properties. It had the power both to heal and to harm. The blood from the veins on the left side of her body was said to be a terrible poison, capable of killing anyone who was exposed to it. But the blood from the veins on the right side of her body had the opposite property. It had the power to heal, the power to cure illness, even the power to raise the dead. This power was recognized by Athena, and the goddess gave some of Medusa's blood to Asclepius, the god of medicine. Asclepius used this blood to develop medicines and potions. He learned to use the right side blood to heal the sick and to raise the dead. With Medusa's blood, he was able to bring people back from the dead, to extend lives, to conquer mortality itself. This ability to resurrect the dead was so powerful that Zeus himself became concerned. The god of all gods worried that Asclepius was upsetting the natural order, that he was allowing people who should have died to remain alive, that he was diminishing the power of death itself. So Zeus struck Asclepius down with a thunderbolt, killing him. But the point here is clear. Medusa's blood, the very substance that flowed through her veins, had power to heal, had power to create, had power to transcend death itself. The woman who could not give birth to her own children naturally, whose curse prevented ordinary creation and procreation, became, in death, a source of healing and renewal. The woman who was transformed into a creature of death became, after her death, an instrument of life. It's almost as though the universe itself was compensating for the injustice that had been done to her, almost as though, even though she was dead, her essence continued to work for good in the world. But it's also profoundly tragic that this power, this remarkable ability to heal and to create, could only come into expression after her violent death. The image of Medusa has fascinated artists and storytellers for more than 2,000 years. Over that time, the ways in which she has been depicted and understood have changed dramatically, revealing much about how different societies and different eras thought about power, beauty, monstrosity, and victimhood. The earliest written sources we have are Hesiod's Theogony, composed in ancient Greece somewhere around the 8th or 7th century before the Common Era, and various references in other early Greek works. Hesiod presents the Gorgons, including Medusa, as monstrous beings, daughters of Phorcys and Ceto, beings that inspire fear and terror. In his account, there is no transformation story. There is no narrative of Medusa being a beautiful maiden who was cursed. She is simply monstrous from birth, simply one of the terrible offspring of ancient sea deities. But between Hesiod's account and Ovid's, something changed. The Greek tragic dramatists, playwrights like Aeschylus, begin to add complexity to the Medusa story. Aeschylus writes about Prometheus and mentions Medusa, and in his work there are hints of a narrative beyond simple monstrosity. The tradition evolves, becomes more complex, begins to ask different questions about Medusa's nature. Then comes Ovid, the Roman poet writing at the beginning of the Common Era, several centuries after the height of Greek classical civilization. Ovid's version of the Medusa myth, found in his Metamorphoses, is the one that has had the most lasting influence on Western culture. It is Ovid who tells the story of Medusa as a beautiful maiden, a priestess of Athena, one who is violated by Poseidon and then cursed by Athena as punishment. In Ovid's hands, Medusa becomes a tragic figure. She becomes someone who has suffered an injustice. She becomes someone whose punishment was out of proportion to any wrong she might be said to have committed. Ovid does not excuse the punishment. He presents it as cruel, and in doing so, he transforms the Medusa story from a simple monster tale into a narrative about the abuse of power, about victimization, about the way that power operates in a cosmos that seems fundamentally unjust. In the visual arts, The evolution of Medusa's depiction tells a story that parallels the literary evolution. In the archaic period, particularly around the 7th and 6th centuries before the Common Era, Medusa is depicted as fully monstrous. Her face is grotesque, almost unrecognizable as human. Her hair is rendered as serpents, clearly dangerous. In many depictions, she is winged. She is terrifying. She is presented as purely a creature of horror and danger. But as Greek art developed through the classical and Hellenistic periods, Medusa's artistic depiction changed. By the time of the late classical period and the Hellenistic era, she is depicted with increasing beauty. Her face becomes more refined, more human, more beautiful. The snakes remain, but everything else about her becomes more conventionally attractive. The image that emerges is profoundly uncanny, a being of perfect beauty topped with a writhing mass of serpents. It's as though the art itself is trying to express the contradiction at the heart of her nature, the beauty she once possessed, now juxtaposed with the horror of her curse. During the Renaissance and the early modern period in Europe, Medusa imagery continued to evolve. Artists like Peter Paul Rubens painted her in all her complexity, showing the moment of her death, her expression full of anguish and rage. The paintings of this era often emphasize the tragedy and the horror of her final moment. In the 19th century, as Romanticism took hold of European culture, Medusa became a subject of fascination for poets and artists. She appeared in the works of Romantic poets, often presented as a tragic figure, often presented as a being of dark beauty and terrible power. Throughout all of these artistic and literary treatments, certain themes recur. The beauty juxtaposed with horror, the power that is also a prison, the creature that was once human, the being that inspires both terror and pity. Different eras emphasize different aspects of this complexity, but the core tension remains consistent. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Medusa has become the subject of intense feminist re-examination and reinterpretation. The rise of feminist consciousness, the #MeToo movement, and a general reconsideration of who gets to tell stories and how stories are told have all contributed to a radical reimagining of Medusa's narrative. In this modern feminist lens, Medusa is understood primarily as a victim. She is a woman who was assaulted by a powerful man, Poseidon, and then punished by another powerful woman, Athena, for the crime of being the victim of that assault. She is a symbol of how women are blamed for the violence done to them, of how female bodies are politicized and controlled, of how women who don't conform to societal expectations are branded as monsters. Feminist scholars and writers have pointed out that in blaming Medusa rather than Poseidon, Athena participated in a pattern that continues to the present day. Victims of sexual assault are often blamed for the assault. They are questioned about their clothing, their behavior, their consent. They are transformed from victims into accused. The perpetrator goes unpunished while the victim bears the consequences. The transformation of Medusa into a monster becomes, in this reading, not just a punishment, but a silencing. By making her monstrous, by making her so terrifying that no one can look at her, Athena ensures that Medusa can never tell her own story. She cannot speak. She cannot be heard. She can only inspire terror. Modern feminist retellings of the Medusa myth have given her voice. They have written stories told from her perspective, stories that honor her agency, stories that reframe her power not as a curse, but as a kind of strength. Writers like Natalie Haynes, in her novel A Thousand Ships, reimagine Medusa's story from her own point of view. In such retellings, Medusa's gaze becomes not just a weapon, but a form of seeing, a way of looking at the world clearly, unclouded by the male gaze or by patriarchal distortions. Some modern interpretations suggest that the snakes in Medusa's hair are not a curse, but a connection to ancient forms of divine feminine power. The snakes, in pre-patriarchal religions and cultures, were often symbols of wisdom, healing, and renewal. The snake goddess imagery that appears in Minoan civilization and in various ancient Mediterranean cultures may have been precursors to the image of Medusa. In this reading, Medusa's transformation into a being with snakes for hair is a return to an older, more powerful, more divine form of femininity that patriarchal Greek culture could only understand as monstrosity. The Had Me Too movement has adopted Medusa as a symbol of the anger and the power of survivors of sexual violence. The image of Medusa, with her terrible power, with her ability to turn perpetrators to stone through her gaze alone, becomes a metaphor for the power of women to look at and name the violence that has been done to them. The monstrousness that was imposed upon her becomes, in this reading, a kind of strength, a kind of power that cannot be ignored or dismissed. At the same time, contemporary interpreters have been careful to note the complexity and the risk in this reclamation. Yes, Medusa is powerful. Yes, her gaze can destroy. But she is also isolated, imprisoned by her power, unable to have normal human connections. She is powerful, but she is also trapped. Her power is also her curse. And in celebrating her power, we should not gloss over or ignore the fundamental tragedy of her situation. Moreover, feminist scholars have pointed out that modern feminist retellings of Medusa risk centering a white woman's story, a white woman's experience of victimhood and survival, while potentially erasing the Libyan and African roots of the Medusa myth. The possibility that the Gorgon imagery has connections to African religious and cultural traditions that predate or exist alongside the Greek appropriation. The question of who gets to reclaim Medusa, whose Medusa we're talking about, whose story we're telling, these are not simple questions. They are questions that require us to remain alert to the ways in which modern retellings can themselves erase or distort, can themselves participate in the kinds of narrative control that originally silenced Medusa. But what seems clear is that in the modern era, Medusa has been recognized as something more than simply a monster. She has been recognized as a being with her own story to tell, with her own perspective, with her own agency and power. And even if modern interpretations sometimes risk oversimplifying her tragedy or using her as a symbol in ways that serve contemporary purposes rather than serving the truth of her myth, the basic impulse to recover her voice, to center her experience, to question the heroic narrative that has been used to justify her destruction. This impulse is, at the very least, a recognition that there was a failure in how her story has been told. We've journeyed through the myth of Medusa, through the ancient sources and the modern reinterpretations, through the artistic depictions and the literary treatments. We've seen how her story has changed, depending on who was telling it, and we've watched as over 2,000 years, the cultural understanding of her has shifted and evolved. So what is the real story? What is the truth beneath all the versions? The truth is complex. There is no single version that is entirely correct, no single interpretation that captures the entire meaning of Medusa's myth. Instead, what we have is a being whose story was told by others, whose perspective was marginalized or erased, whose inner experience was largely left unexplored in the ancient sources. We have a myth that was shaped and reshaped by each generation of storytellers, each bringing their own concerns and their own frameworks to bear. The Medusa of Hesiod is a creature, a being born monstrous, a daughter of primal forces. She is terrifying and powerful, but she is also distant, not deeply examined, not really known. The Medusa of Ovid is a tragic figure, a beautiful woman transformed by injustice, cursed rather than protected, punished rather than avenged. She is someone whose suffering matters, whose tragedy is worthy of commemoration. The Medusa of ancient Greek artists is a figure of evolving complexity, shown as increasingly beautiful even as she remains terrifying, a being that defies simple categorization. The Medusa of modern feminist retellings is a symbol of survival and resilience, a woman whose power has been reclaimed, whose agency has been recognized, whose voice has been recovered. All of these Medusas are, in some sense, real. They are all ways of understanding the myth, ways of extracting meaning from an ancient story and making it speak to contemporary concerns. But underneath all of these versions, there is perhaps a more fundamental truth. There is a story about what happens when power operates without accountability. There is a story about injustice compounded by injustice, about a violation followed by a punishment of the violated. There is a story about a being who had no control over what was done to her, who was transformed against her will, who was separated from society, who was killed while defenseless, whose children could only be born through her death. That is a tragedy. It is a tragedy because it speaks to something that has happened over and over throughout human history. It is a tragedy because it shows us how power can be used to harm, how the weak can be blamed for the violence of the strong, how systems can be arranged so that the victim becomes the monster. And it is a tragedy that continues to resonate because the patterns that Medusa's myth describes, the sexual violence, the punishment of the victim, the erasure of her voice, the use of her image by others for their own purposes, these patterns continue. They happen in the world we live in. They are not ancient history. They are present reality. What we can take from the story of Medusa, in the end, is a recognition that there is always more to the story than what we've been told. There is always a perspective we haven't heard, a voice that has been silenced, a story that has been told from only one side. When we see a monster in mythology, we might ask, what made them a monster? Was it their nature, or was it what was done to them? Who named them monstrous, and why? What would they say if they could speak for themselves? These are not just questions about ancient myths. They are questions that we need to ask about the stories we tell now, about the narratives we create, about who gets to be the hero and who gets to be the monster in the stories that shape our culture. Medusa was beautiful. She was a priestess. She was a woman who dedicated herself to a sacred calling. She was violated by a god and punished by a goddess. She lived in exile and isolation. She was killed while defenseless. Her children were born from her death. Her image was used as a tool of power by those who had killed her. And yet, even in death, some of her power remained. Even in death, her blood had the power to heal. Even in death, her image inspired awe and wonder. She was not simply a monster. She was not simply a victim. She was not simply a beautiful maiden cursed. She was all of these things, and none of them completely captured who she was. That complexity, that refusal to be reduced to a single story, that demand that we hold contradictions and tensions simultaneously, that is perhaps the most important message of Medusa's myth. That is what makes her story worth telling, again and again, in new ways, with new perspectives, for new generations. Thank you for spending this time with me, for descending into the darkness with Medusa, for being willing to ask the difficult questions about heroism and monstrosity, about power and vulnerability, about whose story gets told and whose voice gets heard. If you found this exploration meaningful, I'd love to have you like and subscribe to the channel. These journeys through the ancient myths are something I do regularly, and there are so many more stories to explore, so many more perspectives to uncover. Join us next time as we dive deeper into the world of Greek mythology, where heroes and monsters often turn out to be more complex than we initially believed. Thank you, and sleep well.